Hi, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of Retire with Style. I'm Wade Pfau, and I'm joined by...
Alex Murguia.
Way to pick up that cue. So we're excited to have you all back. And to recap on previously on Retire with Style, we talked about...
Wait. Slow down, slow down. Did you say welcome to another exciting episode of Retire with Style? Did you use the word
Absolutely,
exciting?
Alex. Absolutely.
There we go.
Way to keep up the
momentum.
keep up the energy.
All right. Fly away. I'm sorry, Wade. Go on.
Yes. And so what we want to do today is kind of continue the discussion of where we've been in terms of, in previous episodes, we talked about the two primary distinct factors that help to explain someone's style in terms of how they want to source their essential spending in retirement. And today we'll build on that with some secondary factors. But to recap where we were with the two primary factors, the first one, Alex, it's probability-based versus safety
Yes,
first.
it is. You got that. You're correct, Wade. Good job.
Can you remind us what those mean?
Sure. No, you got me. Yeah. Probability-based and safety first is one of the most distinct factors that came out when we were looking at our retirement income style awareness study. And a probability-based approach is one in which you're comfortable with the probability that the underlying asset that effectively is your main investable asset for retirement, for essential expenses and discretionary, will increase in value. You're betting on that. You're betting on the probability of that time diversification, that over time it'll increase in value. Hence, you can take a sustainable withdrawal from it and not deplete the asset because it'll grow in value. Many times it's the stock market that we're referring to there. Safety first, caveat, nothing is completely safe. We get it, but from a naming convention standpoint, it works, if you will. The safety for probability, the flip side is safety first, and that really implies the belief that while you may get the logic of the probability-based argument, it's not for you. You don't want to be tethered to this probable growth, if you will, and you'd rather effectively remove that liability from your balance sheet and put it on somebody else's from the point of view of a contractual agreement. And so there you have this safety first notion that it really implies contractual income, which on a relative basis is safer than just expecting to ride on the coattails of capitalism, if you will. And that's probability versus safety first. Wade, what do you think? How'd I do there?
Great. Wonderful. Another way you might think about it is just this idea of the risk premium.
Yeah, there
the
you
stock
go.
market. You want to benefit from outperformance of risky assets versus risk pooling, although safety first doesn't have to include risk pooling. But that's the idea of insurance, where you have a group of individuals. Some people live longer, some people don't live as long. And then the insurance company can manage these risks and pay everyone as though they'll live to their life expectancy. But also holding individual bonds to maturity is part of that safety first family.
So Wade,
it's not only risk pooling.
Let's put you on the hot seat now. Why don't you talk about the second factor that we discussed in previous
Yeah,
episodes?
so the other primary set of characteristics is the idea of optionality versus commitment. And optionality, of course, everyone to some extent likes to keep their options open. But if you're optionality oriented, it means you really do want to keep your options open. You want to have the flexibility to make changes, to respond to new opportunities, new events, to not really be locked into anything. And that contrasts to if you have a commitment orientation. It's not that you want to not have any options, but we're talking mainly about how you want to fund your reliable income, and that's not necessarily going to require all of your asset base. But commitment implies you can check this off your to-do list. You found a solution that will solve for a lifetime need, and you don't have to be as worried about it. You're comfortable not necessarily having the full flexibility to make any sort of change you want because you know you have a solution that would work for you. And so when you think about the world, are you really focused on optionality, or are you more comfortable committing to a strategy that you know solves for a lifetime need?
Man, I can't stump you.
Yeah, that was a challenging one.
No, and if you want more, just catch the previous episodes where we really get into these in greater detail. Now, something I think merits discussion is there's nothing magical about these two versus the other uh, retirement styles that we're going to mention. They're, make sense intuitively, but what sets these apart is they do a good job of identifying retirement income personality types, but also solution sets. And I think that's what really puts them over the top. When we were looking at all of these styles, and we'll get to two of them today that we haven't mentioned, when we're looking at all of these styles, probability based, safety first, and optionality commitment orientation were these very distinct styles that again can provide this nomenclature for strategies and profile, but they also explain a lot of the variability present in the other styles when you account for them. So it was just a very unique situation in terms of how they played from each other, taking independently from the from other styles and so forth. The other styles are actually quite telling as well, and so they help really solidify the story that this whole podcast is about effectively. Wade, you wanna start breaking the ice on these two other ones?
Sure, and maybe to be a little bit more clear, so it's not so much that we're talking about styles right now as we are just the factors that help to explain styles.
Thank you, Wade. Thank you.
That might be confusing. But there's four total secondary factors that we identified as having a distinct importance in explaining a style. The two we do want to focus on today in this episode are technical versus true liquidity and front loading versus back loading for retirement spending. And they both have precedence in the academic and practitioner-based world of, well, this is how we came across these factors in the first place, is trying to just understand how people write about retirement issues and looking for ways where there's a distinction. So why don't we start with the technical versus true liquidity? And this is a concept I had first learned about from Curtis Cloak, who's a practitioner. He focuses a lot on insurance-based retirement income solutions. But he explained this very important distinction about liquidity. Like, Alex, if you have a brokerage account,
Yeah.
is that liquid?
Should I be writing this down, Wade?
Well, first, yeah, is a brokerage account liquid?
Yes, it is. Unless it's well, I was gonna make a joke about there's some institutions that good luck transferring those assets over. But yes, for the most part, for the purposes of this, yes, a brokerage account is liquid.
And that's usually how we think about things, but that's, at least at the initial outset, that's technical liquidity. Technically, a brokerage account is liquid, but really the distinction between, we talk about retirement is different. Pre-retirement, you're able to use more of this assets-only model. You're trying to save and grow a pot of assets. Post-retirement, it's called asset liability matching. You have to fund expenses, and you have to earmark assets to cover those expenses. So now, Alex, suppose you believe in the 4% rule, and there's a lot of debate about that, but we can set aside the debate for now.
Yeah, let's pretend.
Let's pretend that the 4% rule is fine. You want to spend $40,000 a year plus inflation from your $1 million brokerage account.
Okay.
Is your brokerage account liquid?
No. No, it is not. In the sense of where you're going with it, no, it is not liquid. In the true sense of liquidity. In the technical sense of liquidity, it is liquid. In the true sense, it is not.
Right. Technically, it's liquid, but in the meaningful, true sense of retirement, it's not liquid. The entire $1 million has to be earmarked to meet your future $40,000 spending goal. You could technically spend it on something else, but doing so would directly jeopardize your ability to meet your future spending.
I think this is
factor.
This is just real quick, Wade. In all seriousness, this is a very important point in our sister. We're part of a wealth management firm, McLean Asset Management, and many times let's say we're managing someone from a total return approach, and there's a distribution that they're taking, and they're right on that line with regards to the probability that they have a success of maintaining such a distribution. But all of a sudden, the kitchen plumbing freezes over for whatever reason, and it needs to be redone. and they see their account and they realize, well, I'll just take whatever 30,000 from there. But specifically to the question Wade just asked me, yes, you can put in a trade order and have it in your account transferred the next day or maybe later that day. But the reality is, it's not technically liquid. That those assets are almost like set aside assets.
Mm-hmm. And the reason Curtis Cloak, when he really, I think he's the one who developed the concept, he was thinking about just explaining this concept with respect to annuities. But specifically, think of a simple income annuity that's life only, so there's no cash refunds, there's no period certain payments or anything. And a lot of the world, when they think about this, will say, well, you don't want to use such an income annuity because it doesn't have any liquidity. And this is where the distinction is, well, indeed, the income annuity does not have liquidity. But if it's possible to earmark less assets to meet a spending goal through the annuity than it is through that investment portfolio, and that's because if you're worried about outliving your money, which gets into another factor we'll talk about shortly, if you're trying to manage a goal with investments only, you may have to set aside more to manage the joint longevity risk and market risk that you'll experience. The risk pooling through the annuity may allow you to earmark less assets to meet that goal. And so though you don't get true liquidity from the annuity, by earmarking less assets to meet your spending needs through the annuity, you're actually freeing up other assets to be a true source of liquidity for the financial plan, because you now have assets that are not earmarked for other purposes.
Wait, I want to say this, but in the other way. But before I do that, just because you threw out the term immediate annuity, you may want to give a quick definition, just in case somebody's thinking, okay, what is a SPIA effectively?
Mm-hmm. So single premium immediate annuity, an income annuity, two different names for the same idea, immediate annuity. It's a tool that may be attractive to the income protection style that we'll be ultimately discussing, not necessarily for every style, but it's the most basic, simple form of an annuity where you give up a premium amount to receive a contractually protected lifetime income. And of course, it doesn't have to be for lifetime. It can include all kinds of other cash refunds and everything else. But the basic idea of a life-only SPIA, or single premium immediate annuity, is I give up a premium today to receive a monthly check each month for the rest of my life, no matter how long I live. And that's what an income annuity is.
And so Wade's example, he was treating it from one end of the spectrum in terms of, okay, if you have this now, you spent money to buy a pension effectively, and you have income for your essential expenses, you don't need to overcompensate, if you will, with and play it safe, or on a relative basis with income that you're drawing from your portfolio. That's kind of the same thing. But wait, when it comes to this, I think some folks kind of listen to the true technical liquidity as, one is earmarked, one is not. You're just taking from the general piece of the portfolio. Talk about mental accounting and this concept, because I don't want people to just think, oh, it's just a mental accounting and that's that.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, it's related to mental accounting, but also mental accounting is where you're just kind of divvying up the pot of assets. You're not really thinking about the liquidity so much as you're saying, okay, that particular, whether it's you have different checking accounts or just you actually have jars with different money sitting on your table. Here's the jar for my restaurant spending for the month. Here's my jar to cover, any sort of clothing expenses, whatever else. It's a way, mental accounting is just a way to divvy up assets for different purposes. And yeah, it's distinct from this idea of true versus technical liquidity. You're still earmarking assets for different goals, but it's a broader, I think, really a broader look at it than mental accounting, which is where you're really dividing up your budget and mentally accounting this asset for this piece of the budget.
It's almost like an extension of what you can potentially do. And so what does this look like in question form? Let me ask Wade, and let's get his opinion on how he feels personally. So let's do our question. So Wade, and take your time answering this so I can throw in some special effects. I prefer to sell assets assigned to other expenses if unexpected retirement expenses arise. Okay? Or, on the flip side, I prefer to have insurance coverage or reserve balances to draw from if unexpected retirement expenses arise. So where do you feel most in line with?
As I've become so steeped into the world of retirement planning and really the core of all that with our funded ratio and with the asset liability matching, I definitely think about this sort of compartmentalization. So I do want reserve assets, not earmarked for other purposes, to be available for unexpected expenses. I don't want to just draw from the same pot of assets that really was meant for something else, but I'll just sort of reorient it and use it for the sort of unexpected spending need that may arise.
Now,
How about yourself?
no comment. Wait, no comment. This is perfect. No. I'm more in the camp that you're from, but I don't think it's much. If you rank these from 1 to 6, 1 being the first statement, 6 being the last statement, I'm probably 4, 3.5, 4 in that range. You give me the vibe you're 5.
You can't say 3.5. That's not.
I know, right? Yeah, you can't get one past weight. I'm closer to 4. I think you're more like a 5. You give me a 5 vibe with that answer. What do you think?
Fair enough.
Yeah. Now I will say this: there's a nuance here, right? Like, first of all, who wouldn't want to be able to reserve stuff? The reality is, though, you can't always do that. But the nuance here is a break even that people kind of do, and there's a bit of a gamble here, I think, and that's, well, if I have these set asides, or if I'm paying years and years of insurance premiums for a very low probability event, and if I would have just invested those premiums, or instead of having a set aside in cash or whatnot, have invested it, then that could, if these events happen just every so often, I could potentially self-fund it, and if I would have kept it invested, my break even, I would have more money at the end of the day. You follow where I'm going with this, Wade, and how it has to do with reserves and not so much freeing up, liquidity and so forth. I think there's some people that approach it like that, like the present value of continually, rolling reserves versus in cash versus just investing it. I'm willing to take my chances. I think there's some people that think like that.
Yeah, and that's fair enough. It's really this idea of, right, back to that simple 4% rule example. The idea is that's supposed to work in the worst case scenario, and in other circumstances, you should have additional funds available to be that source of the technical liquidity can become the true liquidity, and perhaps you're more comfortable relying on that.
I think you may find some people also are technical liquidity, and because they're very comfortable too with being flexible with their income. Let's say they do have to fix the kitchen that year, and the $40,000 distribution for expense for just discretionary becomes $30,000. I guess they don't go to, I don't know, Morocco or Epcot or something like that. Well, that's a lot of money to spend in Epcot. But maybe they just call it a day and do the staycation that year. So if you're willing to do that, then you can. There's more flexibility to some extent, and it may be why somebody maybe more technical liquidity have that sort of preference versus true. Okay, and then just looking at this, you folks may be wondering, well, how do people land? Well, actually, I'm sorry, Wade. Let's talk about front loading and back loading before we get into kind of like how do people usually land on these. Mm-hmm. Why don't you take it away with front and back loading?
Yeah, well, front loading and back loading. It was I think maybe the main inspiration here is Moshe Milevsky, who, at the end of the day, any sort of concept you can think of in retirement planning was in some way probably developed by him because he's so active and so prolific. But he talked about this idea of longevity risk aversion. And longevity risk aversion just means how worried are you about outliving your money? And the more longevity risk averse you are, he kind of explained it as your subjective life expectancy is longer than your objective life expectancy. And that's how we do always think about retirement planning. Like your life expectancy might be 80 or 85, but you might want to build a financial plan that works through 95 or 100 because you're longevity risk averse, because you're worried about outliving your money. And if you're self-managing that longevity risk, you want to make sure you don't outlive it. So that concept, if you are longevity risk averse, that's a backloading preference. You're willing to sacrifice somewhat at the present to better ensure that you won't be in a position later in life where you have to make substantial cuts. You don't want to outlive your assets. You don't want to be old and not have the resources needed to cover your expenses. You'll sometimes see surveys quoted in the consumer media saying the statements along the lines of people worry about outliving their money more than they worry about dying. And of course, that's not going to be everyone, but if that sounds like something you think about, you have a backloading preference. You're longevity risk averse. Whereas with front loading, it's a different idea. It's more, you kind of think in the opposite way. You think, okay, today I'm alive. Today I'm as healthy as I'm ever going to be. I don't know what the future will bring. I want to make sure I can get the most enjoyment, the most satisfaction out of retirement today. And I might not even be alive in the future. So in the improbable event I live to 95 or 100, I am willing to spend less at that point if necessary, just because it's an uncertain outcome that may never happen. I want to make sure I get the most enjoyment and satisfaction out of retirement while I can. And if that resonates with you, that would suggest more of a front-loading preference.
Yeah, and wait, but with regards to this, I think it'd be helpful, especially coming from you. This is where kind of I'm going to throw out a term where people kind of define it, and then after they define it, I really think the folks that are listening to that person, the economist, define this term, they still don't know what the heck they're talking about. Because it's kind of like just a weirdness to it. But how does this differ from consumption smoothing, if at all?
Well, it's related. Now, consumption smoothing is generally this idea that because the whole basic, like the principles of economics 101 is this idea of diminishing marginal utility. The more you can spend, the happier you are, but at a diminishing rate. So people, if they're like risk averse, they generally would prefer to spend the same amount every year versus maybe spending more this year, but then less next year. They prefer a smoother spending path, even if it's a lower average amount of spending than a more volatile spending path. And that basic consumption smoothing idea was always based on no longevity risk, that it was always capital T in the economics model. You live through age capital T, and so you want to smooth your consumption. So what Moshe Milevsky introduced, he wrote an article about spending on the planet Vulcan, which was, if you're Spock from Star Trek, you're the perfectly rational person. If you don't have longevity risk, you know exactly how long you're going to live, you consumption smooth. But if you do have longevity risk, you're going to spend less over time as based on the probability of still being alive at that point.
Yeah,
and the issue is just how much do you want to reduce that future spending versus not, and that's where your subjective life expectancy comes into it. If you're very worried about outliving your money, even though the statistics tell you have a very small chance of living past 100, you might still want to build a financial plan around the possibility of living past 100, for example.
Yeah, and this is where I kind of couch these in much simpler words. Not Wade. I think Wade did a great job, but in terms of words like consumption smoothing, like it sounds like something you put over toast. But from my vantage point, when we're talking about commitment, orientation, and optionality, optionality is when you recognize the logic with regards to a contractual income for the rest of your life, but you end the conversation or the dialogue with yeah, but you end it with like yeah, but Here, to me, front loading and back loading, as opposed to yeah, but yeah, I get it that you should spend relative to the probability you're going to be alive, that kind of thing. And I get it that there's that sort of retirement smile. I get all of those things. But instead of saying yeah, but, you do the just in case, though. What if? What if I happen to hit the longevity lottery, if you will?
So you're saying there's a chance.
So you're saying there's a chance. That's right, Wade. And so you kind of, even though you recognize that I should spend more earlier, I'm more active, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you can't do it because you just won't enjoy yourself. You're too worried about that reverse legacy, where all of a sudden you may be a burden to others, or it's just one of those things that you can't, you won't enjoy it. So you just naturally, you get the logic, you get the the charts and all that kind of stuff, but yeah, just in case you play it safe and you backload. Would you say that's kind of the scientific explanation, Wade?
Yeah, and it's just a matter of how safe you want to play it ultimately. So
Yeah,
if you aren't as worried about it and you're more of a front loader, and at the extreme, you'll hear people say things along the lines of, "Oh, I'm never going to make it past 70," even though they may not have any particular medical reason to say that. But that might be an extreme form of a front loading preference.
Yeah.
Like there is no
Look, man.
tomorrow's not going to happen. Let's enjoy today.
No, and there's a
That
concept
kind of
of
mindset.
in psychology that what is there's no right or wrong here. I mean, but the term that you kind of use to define, maybe you should do something about it, is maladaptive, right? Is it maladaptive? If you're functioning and you're a functioning member of society, productive, whatever, it's a quirk, right? If it crosses that line and it's maladaptive, then maybe there's an intervention to be had. And here the extremes are, if you're front loading to your heart's content, you risk being a spendthrift. I mean, you can't. On the flip side to that, if you're backloading, these are those stories where somebody, passes away, a single person passes away with $10 million, but effectively lived like one of those end of the world folks where, soup cans in the basement, and that was their breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and really didn't live a life, if you will. And so I'm making an extreme example to make a point, but the reality is that there's nothing wrong with being front loading and back loading. If it accommodates with your preferences, but just be careful with when that line is crossed with regards to something being maladaptive, because we've seen it on both sides. Now, Wade, let's see where your line is and if you've crossed it. Where is it? Front loading and back loading. Let me see here. Let's do the first one here. We have a couple of these, and these are questions that we used in our study. These aren't ones that we use to make, are not ones that we use to make the final cut, but they were good nonetheless. So wait, I want to spend more when I am sure to be alive, planning for reduced spending when my survival is less certain. Or, I want to spend with an eye toward being as certain as I can that I will not run out of money as I get older. Where do you kind of tilt towards here?
Well, I think to some extent I would aspire to be more of a front loader, and it's something I have trouble with. But in practical terms, I'm definitely far to the direction of being a backloading preference.
Really?
So that second statement, probably going to have to score a 6, which that our scale of 1 through 6.
Really? Man, of all the ones that we've done, I would have never guessed that. I don't know who you are.
You've got to be kidding.
No, I think I'm more on the left a little bit. It's funny, not too much. I'm more in the mid. I would love to split the baby, but I can't since I only got 6 options.
Yeah,
right?
don't say 3.5 again.
Yeah, right. I'm a 3.5. I'm a solid 3.5 on this one. No, I think I don't know. I'd have to. Now that it's the irony is we ask these to everyone, right? Yeah, I'm about a 3. I think I'm a 3 on this one. At least this particular question. I can see another one where I can be, a 4.
Right.
It's one of those. So I'm definitely. You'd have to ask me 3 or 4 of these.
Yeah, and then that's a broader point that when we determine retirement styles, we're not basing it on one question. There are a battery of questions that
Yeah.
work together to determine the style.
But in all seriousness, I didn't think you were that far in the extreme, or you think it was just this question?
No, I probably, for the most part, am about as far to the backloading direction as
Really?
maybe not the record for the most backloading.
Yeah. But this is
definitely.
important. But let's talk about this. I mean, you're effectively your graduate school has been finance, economy, that this kind of thing. You've been trained, if you will, to think maybe that the consumption smoothing route, the this or that, but it shows you just how strong this is. You're not wrong by any means, Wade, but you follow what I'm getting at? Like, even someone from your vantage point, from your background, from your sort of life experiences, you tilt more towards the far right, where I don't. I just find that interesting, right? Or is it just me, Wade?
I don't know. When we get into styles, we'll talk about how risk wrap is kind of a behavioral quirk of a strategy, and
Yeah,
that's
actually,
my
you're right.
strategy. And so it has some of these. I'm very much like believe in the markets, but at the same time, I have a backloading preference. So
Yeah, 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 yeah,
it's I
yeah.
don't want to be completely dependent on the markets.
Okay, fair enough. Now, I know everyone's on pins and needles. Like, where am I? In the mix. How do I stand here? We did this, national study, and what we found is, let's take true and technical liquidity. You take true and technical liquidity, one being a score of one being technical liquidity, which means you're not earmarking anything. You'll just take from a big bucket, and it is what it is, kind of thing. And true liquidity being that things are earmarked. I have everything earmarked for whatever, and yes, I can't earmark for every possible contingency. For that, I have insurance. Okay, so that's six true liquidity. One is technical liquidity. The average was. Hang on. I gotta.
4.05.
There you go, Wade. 4.05. So what you see here on a relative basis is that folks really want this true liquidity, and it makes sense. If you take a step back, it's funny, right? I don't know if I'm falling to some bias trap here, Wade, but once you see these means, then you begin to kind of do the, oh yeah, I can see why, and you and you put a story behind it, right? For me, the story is, well, who wouldn't want it, right? Who wouldn't want true liquidity? If you can afford it, why not, right? I mean, the reality is probably not everyone can afford it, so there's limitations to it, and so I don't know, Wade.
Yeah, and for a lot of these factors too, actually, just somewhat coincidentally perhaps, but the means do end up being close to right in the middle, but so that there's an equal proportion of people on each side. And so that's not the case with the true versus technical liquidity, which maybe help to contribute to why it's a secondary factor
Absolutely.
instead of a primary factor.
I think ding 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 on that one. I because there's been folks that we've been speaking about this, ask us, hey, how come liquidity isn't as strong of a factor? You think about commitment, orientation, and optionality. Commitment, you're kind of locking something down. Maybe that affects your thoughts on liquidity, et cetera, et cetera. That is a better center from a central tendency standpoint than true liquidity and technical liquidity. They're on a relative basis. People seem to just want that true liquidity more, which then it affects the dispersion. Which to Wade's point, it's probably why it's a secondary factor. From that vantage point, people just like to have things in cookie jars. Front loading, back loading. What would you say, Wade? There, what's the verdict?
Well, that is an example where the population is right in the middle. It was 3.49 compared to 3.5, which there's no statistical difference there. It's
Yeah, it hit
an
it.
equal split between front loaders and back loaders in the population.
Yeah, fascinating, huh? It's one of those things, and this is where this is my point about you think there's something to be said in terms of folks saying, oh well, the rational person should consumption smooth because et cetera, et cetera. You suspend relative to whatever what you had just said, the probabilities of being alive and consistently having this standard of living without fluctuations on that. But here you're kind of seeing my response is maybe, right? Maybe not.
It's a nice split.
Yeah, it's a nice split. Yeah, it's kind of cool. So, for you folks listening, half of you are probably thinking, I don't know what I'm talking about, and the other half are probably thinking, I don't know what I'm talking about. But it evens out to 3.5. So how are the correlations here? How do these factors relate to, how are they associated? Let's say, because we don't know if they're, we don't know the direction, we don't know the causality, if you will, but how are they associated with our probability and safety first and optionality commitment? What we find is a strong safety first tilt is associated with a strong backloading tilt. Makes sense. You know, the more contractual income you want, that means you're thinking about sort of having that income, you know, from a longevity perspective throughout your entire retirement, and you tend to want to backload. If you're doing that, you know, if you're trying to accommodate that, then those two sides of that coin make sense: safety first and backloading. In a similar manner, there's a smaller association, but it's still positive and significant with regards to safety first and true liquidity, which again makes perfect sense, and it goes into Wade's point about if you really go into that contractual income, you've provided yourself, even though you had to buy the pension, you've provided yourself with this extra form of liquidity, and you see the people that have that proclivity for it, you know, tilt towards that true liquidity point of view. Wade, you want to tackle the optionality commitment orientation, or did I mess up the directions when I put the correlation on the table?
No, you got you nailed it. So with optionality commitment, we'll talk about commitment orientation, and it's the combinations we're picking is just so the positive numbers align here. But the commitment orientation is going to associate with more of a backloading preference, which I think makes sense too in terms of if you're more worried about protecting your future self, you tend to be more comfortable committing to a strategy that you know will solve the problem for your future self. And then with technical and true liquidity, the commitment orientation is correlated with the true liquidity mindset. So if you're commitment oriented, you think more about, I want to have assets that are untethered to something else that are available I don't want to have to dip into a common pool of funds to meet a spending need. And that one, I don't know if there's as strong of intuition about why that would be the case as some of the others, but maybe it's something you've been thinking about.
And in fairness, these are correlations, and when you're using a big data set, it's easier, frankly, to come across correlations than not. That's why this is usually just a first step in the data analysis process, but you are seeing some associations there. And to Wade's point, it's a little weaker, but it's still there. It's one of these merits further examination kind of comments. With regards to front-loading and backloading and true and technical liquidity, what you do see is a stronger association with backloading and this true liquidity. And so you see these kind of, you see this intuition playing out. Now, how does it look across genders? There weren't significant differences when it came to true and technical liquidity. Males were, effectively 4.03, and females were 4.07. And that's not a significant difference. And so you see that, from an interesting standpoint, there wasn't much difference between male and female. However, when you're looking at front-loading and back-loading, females tended to think about backloading a bit more. Maybe males, it makes sense from a life expectancy standpoint, doesn't it? Where males are less worried about outliving their assets simply because they have a shorter lifespan. Whereas females, you kind of see this greater sensitivity towards backloading. It's nice to sort of see something like that play out, because it helps tell the story in a consistent way with how other stories are being told. Marital status, you see here, single folks are more true liquidity oriented than not. They're less dependent on others, from that standpoint. Or less dependent is the wrong word, but there are less resources available because there's one less spouse. And so they kind of have to carve out reserves or other things like that a little bit more so than folks that are married. And you don't see any differences, however, when it comes to front loading and back loading. which you would think, I mean, there's a slight, women are slightly more backloaders than men, but not enough to be statistically different. You would think women would, and you can even make the case that maybe it should be significant, again, with that longevity argument that I said for true liquidity, but you're not really seeing that with regards to marital status. Wade, any follow-ups with that?
No, I think you explained it pretty well.
So we did do it. Before the podcast, we were like, man, are we going to go over like descriptive statistics? And we said, heck yeah,
Alex
Wade.
sent me his notes for this.
Of course we are.
It's like, is the audience really going to care about all these correlations?
No, I don't think they care about it. I think when you listen to it, at least I do. Let me see. Not that I care about the statistics, but you're always, when you hear people talk about this, you always kind of inherently wonder, I wonder where I am with that. And so by showing you, hey, look, this is how the average person did, you can kind of begin to get a sense of that. Now, again, what was interesting to me in all of this and looking at the data, my takeaway is, again, going back to the initial RISA profile matrix, which is optionality, commitment orientation, and then probability based and safety first. You put those two factors together, you have a matrix, and you can plot profiles and strategies. What I take from this is that both PS and both probability safety first and optionality commitment orientation are significantly related to technical and true liquidity and front loading and back loading to the degree that they indirectly absorb a lot of the variability that's being explained by those secondary factors. Hence, when you're creating these models for retirement income, if you could explain something in 2 variables instead of 4, just use 2, And so this helps really support the story of the main matrix, but it also sort of shows you how you can use these other factors to give it more heft, if you will, to help tell nuances with regards to the story. That's my takeaway here. Wade?
Mm-hmm.
Come on, man, give me something.
Well, this may be, I think we've got it. So the next 2 factors that we'll be discussing in our next episode are going to be the perpetual versus time-based flooring and accumulation versus distribution. And then that'll give us the foundation for really then putting everything together and to talk about styles in more detail.
Yeah, there's 2 more factors, and there's one that we can discuss that didn't make the cut. So if you stick around, you'll hear that one. All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode. Wade, you want to take us home?
Have a great day.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye now.